in the morning today, we have Christopher Riggs from the Hong Kong Jockey Club. He was the former clinical director there for many years and taught in many fracture repair courses as well, and now is enhancing veterinary care across China, which is very interesting to hear about yesterday.
Thank you.
He's now going to talk to us about strategies to reduce risk.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and very much to the organisers for inviting me to take part. And I think I've been given the job of trying to draw together a lot of what has been talked about this morning and how we might try and apply it in a practical sense. I'd just start off with acknowledging that a lot of what I'm going to talk about, as Ian's mentioned already, is part of a paper that her and I are co-authoring and working on together. As I've got older, I've got a lot better at finding silver linings to bad things that happen in life. However, I have failed to find any silver lining to horses breaking down on the racecourse with fractures. And my heart and my stomach flutters when I hear that radio tweak during a race, or I see a horse falling out during the back. It's just bad news, and we've had lots of demonstrations and examples of why it is bad news. Happily, the one good thing, it took me a while to put this slide together, there are 1,000 horses there. It's relatively infrequent, as we've heard. And from a welfare perspective, there are other things which are probably a bit more important. But it is still a very bad thing, and it certainly is very bad for racing, human safety, and many other things. About 12 years ago, I wrote a slightly controversial editorial in which I said, with the right insight, nearly every catastrophic fracture resulting in the death of a flat racehorse could be foretold. And then, if you can do that, you can lead on to predicting it. So, why so optimistic? Well, it really comes from, again, what we've been talking about. The vast majority of fractures, particularly those in flat racehorses, are not things that happen out of the blue spontaneously. They are the end stage of a progressive process, which through a lot of studies done in different places around the world have characterized the pathological processes are involved in getting to that point. And they're involved in the phase of inflammation, and then damage to the matrix and death of cells. And that gets worse and worse and worse until you then start to get structural compromise. And then ultimately that may result in fracture. And this is a process that is associated with repetitive stress injury. So it's associated with repetitive cyclical loading of the skeleton. And if you get it in time, it's reversible. From inflammation, you can go back to a healthy horse quite quickly. Whereas once you get as far as structural compromise of structural integrity without catastrophic fracture, it takes a little bit longer to get back there. Once you get to the structural failure, if you're very lucky, you'll have very well-equipped people on the racecourse who will get it off, and maybe surgery is possible, but all too often it results in death of the animal, obviously. So if we can focus on this stage and identifying it while it's still reversible, and given the fact that it is a sequence of events, we really ought to be able to identify that at some stage and try and pick up horses that are in that risk zone and return them before they suffer this more serious injury. So, what can we do? Well, there are, as far as I could see anyway, three major strategies. One is to identify factors that increase risk and then modify, make interventions. Alternatively, or as well, recognize individual horses that have something that's going on in them that puts them at higher risk, and then do something to manage those. And then another thing might be, dare I say it, to look at training practices that create the risk and put those horses in that higher risk area and do something to modify those. So starting off with the first, clearly, as Ian Wright has mentioned, if we start putting, and others have mentioned, if we putting fences in, that's obvious. That's going to increase the risk. Of course, that's part of the beautiful sport of national hunt, etc. But it is a risk that comes in that we need to think about and consider. More interesting and more subtle are the many, many risk factors that Tim briefly alluded to and have been studied and characterized in many, many publications. And a very nice one by Peter Hitchens and Chris Whitten's group, where they do a meta-analysis on all the different factors. So we can identify risk factors and we can do things to try and reduce the risk, but it's never going to eliminate it, and it's not going to do much to identify the individual horse. The second thing would be to recognise individual horses, as I've mentioned, that are at elevated risk for whatever reason. And I think the two main reasons for this would be that an individual horse, as we've just heard, may be inherently prone to fracture, or a horse may have a pre-existing injury that is the risk factor for fracture. It's a stress riser that leads to that fracture forming. So work has been done, and again, Tim very nicely elaborated on that earlier on, looking at epidemiological profiling. And I'm not going to go into any of these things in detail because obviously our speakers have done that, but suffice it to say that we are getting closer and closer with that. However, it is still relatively low value at predicting the individual, and it's probably never going to get to the point where we can say this horse is really at danger. It's a contributory factor that will help us make decisions. We can look at the genotypes of the horse, and we just heard that very elegantly. There's some very, very exciting looking developments in that field. As Debbie's mentioned, there are previous publications that have identified genetic variations, particularly on specific chromosomes that are associated with horses that are more likely to sustain some skeletal injury. There are plausible candidate genes that have been identified in studies in humans, similar studies in humans, that could well explain why the skeleton might be compromised. If the physiological processes involved with these coded areas are interfered with. There are then high-risk phenotypes or structural variations in bones. They may be because they're genetically coded for that, or that they have adapted in a certain way. Again, that could be through genetic coding. And there have been a number of things. And again, those have been alluded to. Matthew alluded to them very nicely. And the sort of things, one of the things that's been fairly consistent across many studies is excessive sclerosis or densification of the body of the proximal sesamoid bones. The morphology, the shape of the proximal sesamoid bones has been associated with risk of fracture. Increased thickness of the subchondral bone plate and densification of the subchondral bone and the distal condyles of MC3. All these studies have been done to try and develop tools and techniques that could be used for screening. Again, none of them in their own right are very helpful because they're just not precise enough. So perhaps of more direct focus is trying to identify a horse that's got an injury that's going on that is a precursor to fracture. And there are two really different areas that you could look into. You can look into physiological parameters. So that's really biochemical, or the effect the physiological process might have on function. Can you identify a horse that has increased risk through screening for something within this field? Or then if there's structural integrity or disruption of the integrity of the bone, can you detect some anatomical variation? Detecting physiological signals, the most easiest and important one to apply the lot would be a really good pre-race physical inspection. However, unfortunately, again, as has been talked about, horses with even really quite marked pre-fracture pathology, which the bone is right on the edge of breaking, will trot up really happily. They do not show what's going on under the surface of the joint, unfortunately. So while studies have shown that pre-race veterinary inspection is good at detecting potential soft tissue injuries and preventing worsening of those injuries, it is not good at all for identifying a horse that's at high risk of fracture. And again, in Hong Kong, my colleagues there previously looked at it and estimated that for every one horse you might save, 200 horses that could have raced perfectly all right would be victims, if you like, so taken out. So again, not useful or very remarkable. A lot of work has gone on to looking into biomarkers, and that obviously would be lovely if you could take a blood or urine sample, screen, and say, aha, this horse is going to get a fracture next race. Of course, we're a very, very long way away from that. And there's been lots of talk and rather a lot of promise about that, but we're still a long way from that. They have been shown to be more useful for looking at evidence of joint disease, but not for fracture. And of course, the problem is that you're looking for a minute, although they're huge bones, the fracture originates from a really minute focus that will form the stress riser from which the fracture will propagate. So you're trying to look at that against a massive background of the whole skeleton. It's very, very difficult. The omics studies show a lot more hope in doing that, where we look at huge fast arrays of whatever molecules it might be to try and get some collective pool of molecules that vary in more high-risk horses compared to less high risk. And there is some encouraging data coming out of studies looking at mRNA. But still, there's a lot more work to do in this field. It will no doubt reveal more and more with further studies. Will it be sensitive enough to identify the individual horse? Well, that remains to be seen, but I suspect possibly not. Some quite interesting work that's developed more recently is application of wearable technology. And the StrideMaster system detecting not only cardiovascular metrics, but also looking at stride length, stride frequency, speed, etc. And the only published study in this field so far has demonstrated that there is fairly consistently a change in the stride characteristics of the horses that are injured in the races leading up to the injured race. This was a study done in Tasmania. And then again, there's been quite a lot of publicity of work done in New York. It says that it's very good at indicating horses are about to fracture. But again, they didn't look at all the false, or didn't speak about the false positives that it throws up as well. So again, it might be very, very useful at ringing an alarm bell, but not at specifically identifying that individual horse that's a big risk. Radiography, we've heard a lot of really good stuff and really good practical stuff from Pete about how radiography can identify some really important things. And, you know, so it will miss an awful lot. And we know with the study we did in Hong Kong that it's actually very insensitive at picking up early osteochondral disease at the back of the fetlock. But it can also pick up a lot of things that you would not see if you don't look properly. It has to be done properly. And any vet who's in racehorse practice really, really, really should know how to do it properly. And if they don't, they need to go off and do a CPD course quick before they get in trouble, because they deserve to get in trouble. Scintigraphy, again, we've heard from Mathieu how useful scintigraphy is, and it is very sensitive. It's not very specific in that you can get a big hotspot in a region, which is normal remodeling activity that going on. Of course, we get better at interpreting those, but it is not a thing that you can do lightly. In Hong Kong, we have to keep hold of the horses for 4 days, not 24 days, and in mainland China, it's probably going to be much longer than that. So it's not a sort of thing that you can do lightly. And of course, like radiography, it is associated with a radiation hazard. And we have to think about that too. We're glibly taking all these pre-purchase exams. What will be the consequence of that long term? And sooner or later, that's probably going to be seen as a problem. MRI, again, we've heard about how exciting MRI is at picking things up. Now, of course, not only does it pick up structural things, and this is where it's all neatly fitting together, it also picks up physiological processes that are going on, in the sense that it will identify inflammation, or at least that's probably what that high signal in stir images represent. So, and Sarah Powell has shown that it can be, certainly in her hands, useful at trying to distinguish what a radiological feature that you might be a bit worried about, whether it reflects significant clinical entity or one that's not such a concern at the moment. But again, that's something that needs to be teased apart a bit further. CT, we've heard and we've seen how beautiful that is at illustrating structural change. It is relatively sensitive and relatively specific because of the detailed structural information that we can get from it. The problem is that there is a very high prevalence of pathology in the distal condyles. I remember when I did some work in Liverpool back in the 1990s, a large number of the condyles had what I called linear fissures in the condylar groove. Much, much more, many, many more than the condylar fractures that we see. So you can spot these things, but there are complications in interpreting them. And then again, we saw the really elegant advances that have been made in PET scanning and how that might really help us to develop things in the future. So training practices that create risk and alter them, it is undeniable that a significant proportion of thoroughbred horses will suffer repetitive stress injury. A few number of those will go on to get a fracture, but a lot of them will get significant fetlock disease or carpal disease, which will interfere with their training and also will have an impact on their lives post-training. And we've seen, obviously, as we know that this is a fatigue-related, repetitive-related injury, the more cycles of load, particularly of high-intensity load, i.e. those associated with fast work, the greater the risk of fatigue damage, and that's intuitive and been shown scientifically. We also know from work, again, from Chris Whitten's group, that actually you really don't need to train a horse as hard as a lot of people in Australia do. So in terms of looking at what the group that they looked at, in horses that were trained much less, did just as well compared to horses that train their horses much harder. Now, of course, this is a very complex area and one that's going to be very sensitive. But we need to step back and look at it and say, sure, we've made things better over the years, but the fact is, still, a lot of horses suffer from repetitive stress injury. Is there a better way we can do this to prevent that from happening? And it may be that there is. So that's what we could do. What might we achieve from doing this? Well, the obvious thing would be to have some sort of screening protocol where we could use all this technology. We screen all the horses and we assign them a risk profile, and then that risk profile is carefully analysed, and then when it becomes too high, there are interventions to ban the horse from racing. Tim, again, very elegantly illustrated the real dangers of doing that and the minefield of trying to navigate our way through doing that. There are practical challenges. It's expensive. There are occupational health and safety issues, particularly with ionizing radiation. It's inconvenient and very disruptive to a training schedule, or might be. How long does that profile remain valid for? Do you have to do it once a season, once a month, once a week, just before a big race? Imaging, if we're going to use imaging to identify features, is somewhat restricted to the distal limb. PET scanning, CT, which are probably really an MRI, but PET scanning and CT probably really can't, in the standing horse, can't image further than the carpus or the tarsus. And there's lack of precision with these techniques, and there's a real risk of making an unfair decision based on unreliable data. So maybe we can start teasing our way through these things by combining all the knowledge in all these different fields, all these people we've heard speaking today, try and get them together so that we can progressively narrow the field down, bring the data that each set can contribute in together to narrow it down so that we identify a higher risk subgroup that then maybe imaging can be justified on. I mentioned that we can only image the distal limb, but of course, again, as we've heard in the UK, 53% of fractures, racecourse fractures, would be associated with the fetlock. In Hong Kong, it would be higher than that, and in the US, again, a lot higher than that. So at least if we could really interrogate the fetlock very carefully and determine a risk profile for that, that would help a great deal. And of course, Pete illustrated how you can do that with radiography to a certain extent very well. Another problem is, if you look, you will find, but what does it mean? And that's a real problem as well. We identify all sorts of them. The more CT is used, the more weird and wonderful things we will identify. The real risk averts will say, "Ooh, can't race then." And I fear that might happen in my environment because we're very averse to risk. So we need to start interpreting what those findings are. Now, of course, again, Matthew talked about longitudinal studies in which we just image and look and record and let run, and when they fall apart, we say, "Oh, well, that one was significant. Well, that one's got away with it." And there are ethical and moral issues associated with that. The other thing is we can try and look at laboratory-based models for doing that, and again, briefly referred to the work in Peter Muir's group, where they do an ex vivo study where they take horses with defects in the condylar groove and then load the condyles with mechanical actuators and see how unstable it is, and they characterized the size of a defect which suddenly started to get into the critical area. Maybe this sort of work can really help us to identify images or features that we can see on imaging and characterize a risk profile to them. So ultimately, what we're looking for is something like this, where we minimize the number of false negatives and minimize the number of false positives. The more false negatives we're prepared to accept, then the more pushback we're going to get from society, because that means there are going to be greater numbers of fractures. But conversely, the more false positives we get, horse connections and people associated with industry are going to get fed up. At the moment, it perhaps looks something like this, and I think it's in favor of racing rather than society. So more horses would race perhaps and should do, sometimes is what I'm saying. In the dotted blue circle is perhaps the situation around the Melbourne Cup. And look at the pushback that happened when they started to try and implement something to try and protect racing, try and protect the Melbourne Cup, trying to protect horses in racing. Now, there are good reasons, and I could argue both ways quite well. Modified training practices may require a paradigm shift in the way that we do racing. We've done this for hundreds of years, and it's worked really well. The Industrial Revolution has been around for probably a lot less time. I can't remember my history, but look at what we think of that now. So we may have to make a change, and that may be very difficult, and maybe we can't race a horse so often in a year. We've got to do something different. That's something we probably need to reflect on. But I don't say very much about that because I haven't got a clue what to recommend. And I'd love to see research starting to look into it. How do you manage that factor? What can we suggest? What evidence can we give to trainers that might help them make an informed decision about what they might do or might not do differently? So, of course, on the one hand, in a beautiful, quiet, tranquil racecourse, whether it's in the UK or Australia, wherever it might be in the world, it's nice and quiet and miles away from publicity. What the bloody hell's that idiot talking about? That doesn't refer to me. Come on, let's just get on with it. Life's like this. The fact is, a breakdown at Cartmel or wherever it might be in Australia is just as likely now to make it into the front page of the Daily Mail as what goes on at the Epsom. So it is an interconnected world with a very, very savvy group of people who are against what we're doing and need to be smart at managing that and recognizing that this really is a risk. And it will require very delicate balance with a number of factors involved. And it probably is going to need a group of people working together intently over several days to try and start looking at how can we bring everything together. All these great things you've heard of this morning, how can we start to bring them together collectively to achieve an ultimate goal which is better than the sum of its parts. And I'm sure that will happen, but it's still a little way off, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was great. And yeah, it would be really interesting to get a group of people together to start working on everything we've heard today. So now we're going to open up the floor to questions. Would the speakers like to come forward? Let's open the floor. Has anyone got any questions for any of our speakers today? Could be short and sweet. Go ahead, yeah.
Whereas in the US, there seems to be evidence that they do.
Go ahead.
I'd quite like to answer this one because in the paper we wrote on condylar fractures in, I can't remember, it was late 90s? 89. 99, okay, there you go. Getting old. We never saw in the UK fractures that originated through pod lesions. That's loads and loads of legs I looked at. Whereas, it was not Paul Amiga, the group from Cornell reported that was the cause of pod lesions. So we have rather arrogantly said, oh, no, it's not. But there again, in Hong Kong, probably about 5% of condylar fractures will go through a pod lesion. So if ever there was a condylar fracture for me that wasn't in or close to the condylar groove, then I would be very suspicious it's originating from a pod lesion. Why doesn't that happen in the UK? Maybe because the pod lesions are not so severe. I don't know, Ian, you'll have...
Yeah, I think there are a number of factors. I think one of the things about the UK and the American work is it's a different age demographic. There are a lot older horses in the US, and they've got basically cumulative subchondral damage there. So I think that may well be that they're on a slightly different pathogenetic pathway than a lot of the UK fractures. I think the other thing to say is that, and I think Chris alluded to it, is the harder you look, the more you find there. And if you go through CTs of the condylar fractures, you will find some pod lesions, and sometimes the fractures are in the region of the pod, and sometimes they're not. We don't know, and we don't have that categorized well enough to answer.
I'll just chime in briefly. There are many factors: training, population, demographic. I think medication's a big thing. We just simply don't, when we encounter one of those end-stage pods that's collapsing or has the propensity to be a stress riser for a condylar fracture, it's an exceptional event. You can go a year or two without seeing one, whereas they seem to be much more common in the States. So I think it's training horses on clearly different surfaces, but training on medication through some of the warning signs that we would stop a horse must contribute.
I just had one last thing to that. We've recently done some work, not yet published, but looking at the fracture in the groove and outside of the groove, and we found statistical difference on the workload. And the horses that break down outside of the groove, more likely ready to POD, are cases that have a higher workload. And so I think it fits the other observation. And definitely the question of medication is a big one. This is a limitation of that study. We don't have information about medication, but I think a medicated POD in a horse with higher workload is definitely more at risk of breaking down than an early POD.
Thank you.
Another one for Chris again. You came up with an interesting statistic. I believe that you said for with pre-race trot-ups, every 200 horses that would have been withdrawn, only one fracture would have been prevented. Having obviously been involved with pre-race trot-ups a lot in Hong Kong, I'm sure, are you then not an advocate for it being an effective tool for, prevention of injury? Are there better ways of doing it? How would you sort of suggest here in the UK? Obviously, it's a hot topic. Is it something you would be advocating for, or not necessarily?
Well, just to clarify, I would be classified as a clinical vet, or was, in Hong Kong, and we have separate regulatory vets. And the point from that was, if you went on the clinical findings alone, or the visual inspection of the horse trotting up and feel of its joints, etc., in order to save one horse, you would take out 200 that don't break down. That's the point. I think that doesn't alter my opinion that pre-race clinical inspection is a very good thing, because it identifies a lot of horses that have got incipient soft tissue injuries that would undoubtedly be made a lot worse. It also keeps people focused and more concentrated on their horses. There is a danger, I think, with pre-race clinical inspection, that people focus on getting the horse through the pre-race veterinary inspection, and there is a danger that they may go for medication to try and do that. And it's like, Peter, what you were saying, you're much better off with a horse that's slightly lame, but you know exactly what's going on, than one that you're trying to get through a pre-race veterinary inspection. And certainly I was thinking that a bit more today as well. So that is a potential issue with it. I think on balance, I'm in favour of it, but yeah. But really, you need to get my regulatory colleagues on that one. But Tim, I don't know if you've got.
Yeah, I mean, you do make a good point, and then the decision comes to actually, okay, how many horses would you be willing to prevent that you knew weren't going to end up dead or with a post-race lameness, to prevent the single one? And some of the work we have done in Southern California, which was actually looking at, again, I think the definition in that was limb lameness. I think it was something to do. It wasn't fatality, but it was a different definition, a more prevalent definition. We got that down to about, in quotes, sacrificing 30 horses that would have gone through fine to prevent one. So, and that's where we come. At the moment, the models are at 70%, but some of the more recent stuff it comes up at 85%. If you can get it up above 90%, then actually your ability to limit the damage, in quotes, from preventing those horses that were going to be sound and were going to be fine, significantly improves. So it's a work in progress.
So can I just chip in just one thing there? I don't think you can take it as a broad brush across all injuries, all jurisdictions, all surfaces, because although the work out of Kentucky demonstrated no significant reduction in fractures according to pre-race inspection, there was a marked reduction in suspensory apparatus breakdown injuries, of which over half of those were sesamoid fractures. So there are issues within that group. So it's quite wrong to dismiss pre-race clinical examination as being an irrelevance.
Can I make some observations, please? Sally Taylor, I work for the BHA, and so as a veterinary officer, I get to see these horses that presented for pre-race examination. And I'd just like to say that there are alternative reasons for examining horses. In part, some of the horses that are presented are a welfare concern with the degree of lameness that they are brought to the racecourse with. There's the public perception, not only of the degree of lameness, so that we must not be presenting horses on the racecourse that are visibly lame, but also there is this argument of social license, which Ian so eloquently spoke about earlier, and part of maintaining and establishing public trust in what we do is transparency. And if we are not looking at these horses and having an independent vet verify that these horses have no discernible reason why they should not be on a racecourse, and that does include soft tissue injury. Indeed, only last week 2 horses were presented with inflammation of the superficial digital flexor tendon, subsequently scanned as having core lesions. So it isn't just about fracture prevention, and I recognise the limitations with that. We're also doing some work at the moment looking at the effect of pre-race exam, and we're in the privileged position here that we don't pre-race exam everything. Of course, if you go to the States and jurisdictions where pre-race examination has been mandatory for a long time, it's very difficult to see the difference or the change that it might make, whereas we are in the position that we can compare meetings where we look at all horses with meetings where we don't look at all horses. And whilst it does need further numbers and evaluation, early results show that there is an improvement in risk of fatality and long-term injury for horses at meetings where pre-race examination has occurred. Thank you.
I'll just step into the fray a little bit. If you step back from the emotions, if you're just looking at a pure test, you know, is lameness a risk factor? Lameness at a one-off examination a risk factor for that race? And clearly the evidence supports that it isn't a useful test, just as any screening test that has low sensitivity, low specificity. We've done some work, part of which Tim has analysed. We haven't published it yet. Large number of pre- and post-race trot-ups in yards, obviously subjective, obviously, you know, vet-based observations. But just to throw some figures out, about 30% of horses are reported with a lameness or action worth noting, and about 10% or 8 to 10% a clear lameness, depends what scale you want to use, but above 3 out of 10 lame. So, you know, a lameness no one could quibble with. And so when you've got a population of animals racing with quite a large proportion of lameness, and yet a very, very low fatal injury rate, that as a test is not a very good objective test. And you're going to have a lot of, and add to that the fact that we don't consider that grade of lameness is necessarily correlated to risk of injury. So I agree that pre-race inspection is a good thing in terms of lifting everyone's games, but as a, you know, lameness as a pure metric for determining risk for that animal on the day, it's not a useful test.
Can I just wanted to ask a question in relation to that. Is like, do you think we're in a privileged position here in Newmarket, or, you know, just actually the audience, the privileged position of this audience is that we have very good veterinarians here, very good trainers, and, you know, we've discussed that, you know, you have a great client relationship, but not every trainer has that. So do you think you do need some regulation at the track for like people that aren't in quite as fortunate positions as like what we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I mean, I think even in Newmarket, there are yards that only see a vet on occasion. So, and trainers who want vets to come in just to stick needles in certain joints. And I think if we push back against those practices, then everyone will benefit, and those high-risk horses won't be running. So yeah, lifting everyone's games and focusing the spotlight on presentation of horses, but saying that a lame horse shouldn't run is tricky, because you cannot train horses without having some lame horses. It's the same in human sports. You can't reach any sort of decent, attain any sort of decent athletic potential without sustaining injury. And so lameness and some sort of subchondral bone injuries are part and parcel of training. So if you recognize that as a fact, then lameness comes with that. And that doesn't mean the horse is suffering. I would venture to say many of the best racehorses in the world that have had long, successful careers, retired fine, and had happy lives afterwards, have been some of the lamest horses that one could present for discussion, and yet they're happy training. They don't finish with long-term problems. So if we start using lameness as the determinant of whether a horse should run or not, I think that's very tricky.
I'd like to
regardless of where it's from.
I'd like to comment on that and take the California model as an example, because I think a bunch of the limitations that are pointed by Pete is just like one single examination is a challenge. But I think what the Californian racetrack have started doing is really have like independent vet eyes on these horses at every training. And I think it does cover, like, as the question was asked, like some people have great vet care, great monitoring longitudinally, but I think it's really interesting, and it's more tricky, and the logistic from the regulatory side is more complex, and it's easier to do like in the US when we have all the horses training on one same track. But I think having that longitudinal look from the regulatory side is very helpful. And then bringing back the question of like, combining the different tools and preaching a bit for, my area, I think we all agree that general screening is going to be tough, but I think the big role of imaging is like clearance to race. And these are the cases where for the regulatory vets, it's a headache, it's a nightmare that you have that horse that's like slightly off. And I hear Pete's perspective, it's just like, and if we look at Tim's number, yeah, this horse is off, but the number is most likely going to be fine. But the regulatory vet in that situation is, if that horse breaks down and he was lame, and we have countless of examples of that on the web, you're in a really bad shape for that regulatory vet in perspective, for horse racing in general. And so that's where having that first level of like scrutiny and bringing these horses might need some advanced imaging to give them clearance to race. And then I'm the one more under pressure with giving clearance to race to these horses. But I think this is where it helps. And that's something that's very important to explain to the trainer too, because I think a lot of the trainers are scared of advanced imaging. And it's like, well, we're gonna scan the horse and you're gonna tell me not to race, and it's not the case. And we've shown that to several trainers in California. I would say the horses that are flagged by regulatory vets and they're asking for a scan before racing, I don't have exact statistics. I'm going to get Tim to work on that maybe, but I'd say we're somewhere at 50-50. There's a bunch of horses that are flagged for mild irregularity and there's some debate, and we're like, okay, and then it brings another question. It's like the fetlocks are clean, so are we sure it's not going to blow a humerus? And that's where the epidemiology data is going to be important. But I think there's an interesting path there.
Question at the back, please.
Could I ask the panel, obviously having in Hong Kong the complete veterinary history of all these horses is leading to much better statistics and modeling, would the panel think it would be better